what the end of the de minimis exemption means for shippers. Is the EV market maturing? And measuring supply chain performance. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. I am Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by DHL Supply Chain. Where can supply chain professionals go for the latest news and insight? DHL's All Business, No Boundaries podcast is a collection of supply chain stories by DHL Supply Chain, a North American leader in contract logistics. Check out DHL's Supply Chain's All Business, No Boundaries podcast, available at dhl.com/ABNB podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, last week the de minimis exemption ended. This tariff exemption applied to imports of low value. To find out how its loss will affect supply chains, we welcome back a familiar guest. John Lash is the Group Vice President of e2open. John, welcome back to Logistics Matters.
Pleasure to be here, Dave. Thank you.
John, for those not familiar with e2open, could you briefly tell us about your company and its role in the supply chain industry?
Sure thing. e2open helps companies at every step of the way as they make, move, and sell stuff around the world. Think planning, sourcing, manufacturing, logistics, tariffs and duties, distribution, basically you name it, right? We're also a large, if not the largest, global trade management provider in the market, helping companies ship goods across borders, stay current with changing tariff policies, and automate manual trade processes. And with all the tariffs and counter-tariff actions that's going on and the changes in trade policy, this is a pretty hot topic area these days.
Yes, it certainly is, and you're well experienced at being able to talk today about our topic on the end of the de minimis exemption. So that occurred last week. Briefly, can you tell us what the law was and how it was applied to imports previously?
Yeah, so for context, the term de minimis in Latin, for those that aren't fluent in Latin, means something of little importance. And de minimis has a long history that dates back to 1938. It promotes trade and lowers barriers to global commerce by streamlining the import of low-value items, typically from small shippers. In short, it's to allow the imports of small packages without all the red tape that normally has to happen for importing things. And it was long thought of as a good thing until it wasn't.
So why is it now not considered a good thing, and why was that red tape put back onto these kinds of imports?
So think of it two ways. There's what put de minimis in the crosshairs, first of all, was the explosion of parcel volume with the onset of Chinese fast fashion e-commerce, right? This business model, it exploited de minimis, following it to the letter of the law, but certainly not to the spirit of the law. And by 2024, more than 1.3 billion packages were imported to the US via de minimis. And at up to $800 per package, that's a lot of import value bypassing the system to the tune of around $1 trillion or so. So going back to de minimis as something of little importance, this is no longer of little importance, which is why it was referred to as a loophole. But what finally took down de minimis was the change in trade policy. And it was really a two-step process. The first step was in May for shipments from China and Hong Kong. And consider two facts here. The first is that packages from China and Hong Kong, they represented around 75% of all de minimis entries at the time. And then in April, if you'll recall, tariffs spiraled up to 145% on imports from China. And with these triple-digit tariffs, this loophole became big money to the tune of around $1 trillion in avoided taxes. So a shutdown was inevitable, right? And this is a consequence of trade policy. There's just too much revenue to miss. Now, if we look at this latest action in August, consider two more facts, right? A trade war designed to raise trillions of dollars in tax revenue, well, it needs policy with teeth. And once tariffs of between 10 to 50% were levied on imports from almost all nations exporting to the US, closing the de minimis exemption was almost like a foregone conclusion because if all it took to bypass paying stiff tariff rates was to break shipments down to small packages, then the policy would have no teeth. So that's essentially why the de minimis exemption is closed at this time. It's to support a shift in trade policy towards tariffs as a major source of government revenue.
Well, I guess that makes sense when looking at the trade policy we have now. As you know, many postal services around the world have actually stopped some of their deliveries to the United States because of the tariffs now being applied to these shipments. Will that eventually be worked out to resume those kind of deliveries, or will some nations just not really send products to us?
Yeah, I think it's going to be eventually worked out. The problem here isn't just a change in the regulations requiring duties to be paid on small packages, but the requirement for the foreign postal services to collect those duties from the exporter. Normally, it's the other way around, right? Where it's the importer that pays for the duties. And this change to go and collect and remit duties to the US authorities requires changes to the postal systems and processes, right? Because they're just not set up for that. And as a result, many of these postal services halted service on shipments under $800 until the systems and processes can be put in place. Like it makes a lot of sense. And once they're in place, the packages will resume their flow. But I suspect it's going to be at a slightly lower volume than before for two reasons. The first one is the higher cost of goods once these duties get applied is likely to dampen some of the consumer demand. And then the second one is that the new filings processes, well, they're kind of complicated. And it's going to get especially complicated after February 2026 when the flat rate option expires and the full valorum declarations are required.
So that is going to have a lot of effect on small importers. What do you see happening with them, and how will that change the way those kinds of businesses operate?
Yeah, well, I think the loss of de minimis will mean American consumers and businesses will get hit with higher import costs on small imported goods, right? The result is a direct inflationary pressure, and unfortunately, it's going to be one more blow to an already fragile consumer confidence. And it also goes and puts pressure on the small overseas exporters, or those in Canada and Mexico, by essentially raising the barrier for these businesses to access the American market. Because in addition to the cost, many of these small businesses, well, they're small, so they lack the resources to manage the more complex custom filing processes. So many of these are apt to abandon the US market altogether, which kind of goes back again to the American consumers because these goods tend to be more like boutique items, things like specialty apparel or cosmetics, things that you can't buy domestically. So that's why the consumers go and reach out internationally. And if these businesses decide to exit the market, then on top of that, consumers lose choice. And when a lost item is a cherished item that means a lot to the consumer, it tends to carry a bigger emotional punch that can go and asymmetrically erode consumer sentiment.
As you mentioned earlier, this was originally applied to Chinese companies. Earlier in the year, the exemption was eliminated for them. And one of the goals that we understand was to counter the import of cheap products from China and e-commerce companies like Temu, those kind of folks. Will this actually help domestic e-commerce companies now that that exemption has been eliminated?
Yes, it did help domestic apparel e-commerce companies and traditional brick and mortar too. These companies follow traditional trade models where they import in bulk, pay duties, and distribute domestically. And back in April when the tariffs hit triple-digit levels, there was simply no way for these companies to compete against the Chinese e-commerce that essentially got a hall pass on duties through de minimis. And no surprise, when the de minimis from China was ended in May, it virtually shut down Chinese B2C e-commerce to the USA. So it's really important for domestic apparel business. This has been an important step. Now, I expect the impact will be less pronounced for this latest action because there isn't the same degree of the misuse of the spirit of the law from the other countries as we saw with Chinese e-commerce.
Makes sense. You had mentioned before that the consumer confidence is a little ragged right now. Will the loss of this exemption, do you think, fuel inflation and further reduce consumer confidence?
Unfortunately, I'm afraid it will. The cohort that really takes it on the chin with this action is the American consumer, with higher prices for these specialty imports. So whether the consumer's importing directly or buying through retailers, essentially the total landed cost just got higher, right? And these costs will be passed through to the consumer. And while the items in question represent a pretty small segment of the economy, it's still yet another inflationary pressure on top of what we're facing. So it will go and impact consumer confidence.
So overall, what does the loss of the de minimis exemption mean for shippers and others who are looking to access products from other markets, and how might it affect the upcoming peak season we're about to enter?
Yeah, I think it means that we're likely in for a rougher holiday season, right? Which is why there's such an emphasis on the back to school sales to get things, to basically sell while the getting still good, right? And I even saw last week that the Halloween sales have already started. So that's the strategy. Stay plugged in and move fast when opportunities present themselves. Sell before the consumer confidence slows down demand, and source whenever you get a break in your favor. A lot of companies, they went and pre-positioned inventory to get ahead of tariffs. But of course, that stock is running out. And with the on again, off again tariffs and the changing rules and all these things that are happening, and then, of course, the latest court ruling that threatens to overturn the tariffs altogether, stay connected and plugged in with the latest modern trade management services so that you can be ready to move fast when an opportunity arises to replenish at a lower price. So this is no time to be fumbling around with slow manual processes. So, in general, while there's too much uncertainty to make long-term plans or even medium-term decisions, companies can seize these short-term opportunities when they present themselves. And those that do it better will come out ahead.
Makes sense. We've been speaking today to John Lash, the Group Vice President of Product Strategy at E2open. Again, John, thanks for being with us on Logistics Matters today.
Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure.
Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And Victoria, we continue to report on the growth of the electrical vehicle market. There was steady movement in recent years for adopting EVs, but now with course changes in Washington, it seems that EVs have hit some sort of a speed bump. What's the latest?
Well, Dave, the short answer to that is that the EV market in the US is maturing despite some recent challenges, as you note. This week, we saw some new research about the growing adoption of electric vehicles in general. So, this is in consumer circles as well as for commercial and other uses. And it caught my eye because it echoes some recent statistics about EV uptake in logistics as well. So, Here Technologies, which is a location and data technology platform, teamed up with an automotive research firm called SBD for their third annual Here SBD Index 2025, so for this year. The index assesses EV infrastructure and uptake maturity across all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and also 30 European countries. And the study found that the United States is entering the early stages of widespread EV adoption. But as you noted, there's a catch. So adoption is growing, but it has slowed over the past year. And that's due in part to expiring tax incentives and shifting government policies. To put some numbers to that, the study found that over the past year, the U.S. has added 37,000 charging points, that's a 19% increase, and boosted total charge power by 52%. But that's down from the year earlier when there was a 32% increase in charge points installed across the US and an 82% surge in total charge power. There's also a consumer component to this study. The researchers surveyed 1,000 US drivers and 1,000 drivers across Europe, and they found that Americans are more resistant to EV adoption than our European counterparts. And that's largely due to concerns about charging infrastructure. So it seems we have a little bit more range anxiety here in the States, but that may make sense. We've probably got a little more land to cover.
Yeah, it does make sense. And it is encouraging that you're seeing all those charging stations being applied now and that adoption is growing. Even with that growth, it is slowing down, as you mentioned. You said this is in line with industry trends as well. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, of course. So the research echoes recent industry data citing momentum in the uptake of zero emission heavy and medium duty trucks for commercial and industrial applications. ZETs, as they're known, include both EVs and hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles. So this research is a bit broader than what I just mentioned. And it's June data from Clean Transportation Consortium CalSTART, which showed a 76% increase in ZET deployments from 2023 to 2024. But despite those gains, the report cited similar barriers noted in the HERE SPD index. Things like higher vehicle costs, infrastructure challenges, and of course, policy uncertainty at both the state and federal levels. So there's some similarities there. One other note that I wanted to mention, going back to the HERE SPD index, they ranked the top 5 states, or the top states, I should say, for EVs based on infrastructure and adoption criteria. And the top 5 are Delaware, Washington, D.C., New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts in that order. So if you live in any of those areas, you're likely to see more EVs on the road.
Interesting. Personally, I believe if we don't continue to invest in transition to EVs, then the U.S. will fall even farther behind China and other countries in developing the batteries and other EV technologies that will move the rest of the world and maybe leave us behind.
Yeah, well, the growth is, like I said, it's still growing, just slowing. So we'll have to see what
Just
happens.
slowing.
Yeah,
Thank you, Victoria.
you're welcome.
And Ben, it's often said in supply chains that you can't manage what you can't measure. But you wrote this week that there's a lot of inconsistency in how companies manage their performance. Can you explain what's happening?
Yeah, I'm glad to. This was a report that I saw this week about KPIs, which is, of course, the acronym for Key Performance Indicators. And that has been, in a general sense, one of the sort of keystone ways to measure your own or your contractors or your competitors' performance and make sure that they match up with your standards or that things are getting better over time. But it turns out that various sectors throughout the economy use KPIs in different ways. That conclusion came from RXO. They're a transportation service provider and a freight broker. They used to be a part of XPO, the big transportation conglomerate. And RXO said this week that they had profiled the uses of KPIs in 6 different industry verticals. That was automotive, consumer packaged goods, food and beverage, healthcare, manufacturing, and retail. And the researchers said that understanding how the entire freight market approaches KPIs is an essential foundation, but different industries have slightly different norms and requirements.
Well, that sounds like an important distinction, Ben. Is that because those sectors handle very different types of freight?
They sure do, right? So that sort of explains some of their key takeaways here. There are 5 interesting conclusions on those different sectors. So food and beverage shippers are the biggest believers in KPIs. That they had the highest percentage of respondents in this study that said that they believe KPIs are an essential part of their logistics management. So, like you said, if you're shipping food and beverages, sometimes you have to keep them in temperature, or you have to keep them, arriving on time. They stay fresh, this kind of thing. Likewise, healthcare shippers, turns out, are the most advanced at KPI tracking. This comes from measuring their ability at tracking supply chain metrics, and they were the ones who saw their sector as the most advanced at that. Retail and healthcare shippers were both the most likely to use AI with their KPIs. So there's a lot of letters there, but artificial intelligence. So they're beginning to apply that because KPIs, of course, create a lot of data. So that's one way to sort through it. And an interesting point, 2 more final points in the study here. Automotive sector and consumer packaged goods, those 2 shippers are using KPIs to get tougher on their carriers. So what they're doing is they're raising their carrier KPI standards, and that's in an effort to try to meet increasing consumer expectations and demands. And finally, manufacturers are the most demanding overall. And that comes from their plans, their expectations to exceed industry standards across certain KPI targets. They mentioned, to be specific, things like on-time pickup, on-time delivery, primary tender acceptance, shipment lead time, payment terms, demand forecasting accuracy. You can see there's a KPI for almost everything. but manufacturers was the sector that was most demanding about it.
Well, that's really interesting, and I guess it just goes to show the complexity of our supply chains and how difficult they are to manage. And what's important to one sector may not have the same degree of importance to another.
That's a great way of explaining it. Yep.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank John Lash of e2open for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. Speaking of subscribing, check out our sister podcast series, Supply Chain in the Fast Lane, co-produced by the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals and Supply Chain Exchange. We just released a new 8-episode series on the top threats to our supply chains. A few of the topics we address are geopolitical risks, economic instability, cybersecurity risks, threats to energy and electric grids, supplier risks, transportation disruptions, and more. All 8 episodes are now available to stream, so check out Supply Chain in the Fast Lane wherever you get your podcasts. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by DHL Supply Chain. Where can supply chain professionals go for the latest news and insight? DHL's All Business, No Boundaries podcast is a collection of supply chain stories by DHL Supply Chain, a North American leader in contract logistics. Check out DHL's Supply Chain's All Business, No Boundaries podcast, available at dhl.com/ABNB podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.